Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast. Episode number 13. Lucky number 13. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. The country is in an uproar over the leaking of a potential decision by the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade. Let's discuss in depth the actual Roe v. Wade decision and ask ourselves, do the ends justify the means? The Department of Homeland Security comes out with an announcement, very discreetly, mind you, of a new governmental agency, the Disinformation Governance Board, empowered to seek out all of the propaganda that's being promulgated by foreign actors, by adversaries of the United States. Dubbed the Ministry of Truth, we now have in this country to call our own a Ministry of Propaganda. And finally, Episode 4 of the season finale of Better Call Saul, a recap. Before we begin, thank you all for listening. I appreciate it. Please give the podcast a like, a thumbs up, distribute it far and wide. If you are so inclined, This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. If you like what you hear, please support financially. Let's get the show on the road.
Act 1, Roe v. Wade. Do the ends justify the means?
As a social experiment, dear listener, you could ask 100 random people on the street whether they believe that the ends justify the means. If one is working in service of what a group of people, a community, a town, a city, a state, a nation, what the society believes is morally right, do the ends justify the means? Most people reflecting on that question would tell you, no, the ends don't necessarily justify the means. And the logic being that if the ends can justify the means, then those means can be used to serve a number of different ends. You get into a debate about what is truly morally right or morally wrong, what is acceptable within a society or unacceptable. What we have concluded here, at least in the United States of America, is that you want to have a fair and balanced process because you can't always see all ends. The ends don't necessarily justify the means. What we want is a process that's fair and balanced for all that will reach, generally speaking, a true, a just, a moral end. At this point, I think if you took such a poll, you'd get probably 60-70% of people saying that the ends don't generally justify the means. Whether or not that's different from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I believe that the balance of people would argue that the ends don't justify the means. Now, in practice, when people go out into their lives, do they actually act in accord with this belief that the ends don't justify the means? No. No, they don't. None of us do. We routinely support the means if they justify the end that we want to reach. And no debate, no issue, no question before us as a society, as a people, speaks to this better than abortion. As I stated in an earlier podcast, although people consider themselves very sophisticated, particularly when it comes to the art of voting, of determining who they're going to support, what kind of policies, politics, people they're going to support, the fact of the matter is most voters are single-issue voters. If you bring up an issue and you give the thumbs up or thumbs down, the yes or no on that issue to the voter, that person will vote for someone based on whether or not they're seeing a thumbs up or a thumbs down, a yes or a no. Abortion's a great example of this, and so are guns. Are you pro-life? That's going to determine whether or not most voters are going to vote for you or vote against you. Do you support gun control? That is going to determine for most voters whether they're going to vote for you or vote against you. The issues are so contentious that most people support whatever means they can employ, that their so-called leaders can employ, that any government agency can employ in order to reach their desired end. Now that brings me to Roe versus Wade, the 1973 case that legalized abortion throughout the United States with restrictions, and the leak that came out about the Supreme Court in 2022 authoring an opinion by Justice Samuel Alito. The Supreme Court is probably going to vote 5-4, if not 6-3, to overturn the Roe decision. The debate is raucous. It's fierce. And the one thing that I haven't heard in said debate is any in-depth analysis as to why the Supreme Court could even fathom overturning the Roe versus Wade decision. In the debate about abortion and its legality in the country, there is very rarely a discussion as to whether or not abortion is a constitutionally protected right based on the decision that was set forth in Roe versus Wade. For those that believe that abortion should be legal, the ends justify the means. It is a foregone conclusion. The Supreme Court couldn't have reached a different conclusion. The logic of it is very rarely discussed. I'm not going to bore you with a long recitation of what's actually set forth in the decision, Roe versus Wade. You can go and read it for yourself if you want some really good sleeping material. I'll sum it up for you, and I am not trying to sum this up leaning to one side or the other. Let's speak to the decision as it is set forth, the logic of the decision. There is a right to privacy that is protected under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America. What does that mean? The Supreme Court, outside of abortion, has taken a very broad view of what life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness means in the Constitution of the United States. In the Due Process Clause, the 14th Amendment, there is a body of law where the Supreme Court will look at different life, liberty, pursuit of happiness issues, privacy being one of them, and will broadly rule in favor of an individual's right to privacy against leaning or favoring the rights of the government to regulate conduct. There was no leap of logic that there was a right to privacy that was time-honored by the Supreme Court when Roe versus Wade was set forth. What the court concluded in Roe versus Wade was that the right to privacy included or equals dominion over one's body. And in that dominion, one could elect to abort a fetus. Now, why could one abort a fetus? Because a fetus is not a human being. It's not a person. Yet, the court set forth an interesting standard by which the government could regulate abortions. First trimester, there is no regulation. Second trimester, there could be some regulation. And third trimester, the government could ban abortion. So even within the scope of the decision, there is a right to privacy. A right to privacy for a woman includes dominion over her body, which includes the fetus, which is not a person. Yet, there is a standard under the timeline of the development of that fetus where the government can begin to regulate abortions. Now, I dare you to send this to the most liberal of people and have them critique what I just said. That's pretty much what the decision states. Right to privacy equals dominion over one's body, fetus included, fetus not a person, yet there's this timeline where we discuss the development of the fetus in relation to when the government can, in fact, regulate abortion. I read Roe versus Wade in law school, as most law school students did, and it struck me on its face to be a logically weak argument. Let's start at the beginning. I don't believe it's a stretch to go from we all have the right to privacy, and that right to privacy then extends to this concept of dominion and control over one's body. Is it a bridge too far? No. I think it can be logically set forth that dominion and control of one's body is encompassed by the right to privacy. Now here comes the problematic parts in my mind. The right to privacy extending to dominion and control of a woman's body, yet the fetus doesn't have any rights of dominion and control, doesn't have any rights to privacy, because the fetus is not a person. That argument in and of itself is always going to be problematic. The notion that this is some sort of concrete, well-decided, well-concluded legal fact, scientific conclusion, it's absolute nonsense. This is the foundation of Roe versus Wade. Fetus, not a person, does not have the same rights of privacy, which then extend to dominion and control over one's body. This right does not extend to the fetus, and it doesn't extend to the fetus because the Supreme Court says so. What does the Supreme Court base this on? Nothing. No foundation is laid to state with certainty that the fetus is not a person. Now let's extend the logic even further. The court sets forth a 3-trimester standard that governs the regulation of abortion. In the first trimester, there is no regulation. Second trimester, regulation. Third trimester, a state could say, hell no, you can't do it. Take your emotion out of it, dear listener. Look at the logic of it. To reach the conclusion that the woman has dominion and control over her body such that she could abort the fetus because the fetus isn't a person, and then yet turn around and by way of the development of said fetus, regulate whether or not the woman could have an abortion, is in and of itself a logical fallacy. It is inopposite. The court is essentially setting forth when a person becomes a person. And it's doing so based on the trimesters of a woman's pregnancy. Agree with it? Disagree with it? Are you going to argue to me, dear listener, that it's sound legal reasoning based on logic, based on science? When you look at the totality, it's clear to me, at least, dear listener, that the Supreme Court had concluded we're going to rule that abortion is legal in all 50 states. And we've got to find a way to do it. We've got to find the means to bring about this end. Those means were logically, legally, scientifically weak. That is not to say that the end is not somehow justified, that there isn't some rationale that one could reach, that what they did was right. It is to say they used means to reach an end that were weak and that were always on the precipice of falling apart. Consider what the court concluded. Life begins. A human being can be called a person, which then is afforded the rights of any other person in this country after the first trimester of pregnancy. That's sound reasoning. That's sound law. I really don't care, dear listener, what your position is on abortion. I have always, and I'm not afraid to put forth as much, I have always believed that abortion should be made legal one of two ways. That Congress passes an act that legalizes abortion in all 50 states, or it is a state issue. The state should vote on whether or not abortion is legal or illegal. It is not a constitutionally protected right. And it is simple why it is not. You have to disqualify the fetus as a person, and you have to make a moral, legal, and scientific judgment to do so, none of which have been decided in law, in science, or in morality. It was simply the ends justifying the means. Abortion to me is such a fascinating issue because I look at both sides of the issue, these polar opposites, and to me they look exactly the same. You've got people making moral judgments without any empathy or compassion for the other side. You've got people making scientific judgments that are not based in science whatsoever, but most in particular, you've got people who think they're on the right side of morality. You can't convince any pro-lifer that the pro-choicers have any foundation, any moral compass, and vice versa. These two polar opposites are, in fact, simply reflections of each other in a mirror. They are mirror images of one another. All the hate, all the anger, all the separation, the frustration, the animosity, they are mirror images of one another. Now, you may look at them and say, well, they have different labels, and they have different uniforms, and they have a different lexicon, they have different geographic locations. These are all on the periphery. These are all tangential. They're inconsequential details. Look at the core of these people. They're all the same. Either one of them is willing to employ any means necessary to get to the end that they want to reach. How often is that us? How often is this me? How often do I go through and I justify any action or conduct that I'm engaged in to justify the end that I want to reach? How would I react if approached and questioned about whether or not I support the moral, the correct end, justifying any of the means that were undertaken to reach that end? How fair are we to ourselves? How fair are we to one another? This is an excellent illustration that we aren't very fair with one another, and we're very likely not very fair with ourselves. This incongruence, this separation, it's just a reflection of us, who we are. And a further illustration of how much incongruence we have within ourselves, look at Congress. Look at the presidency. You've got a Democratic House, you've got a Democratic Senate, and you've got a Democratic president. And Democrats, in general, claim to support abortion. It would seem that this would be the perfect time. That if you were going to settle the issue once and for all, you would have Congress enact legislation making abortion legal in all 50 states. As I pose this question to you, what's the likelihood that that's going to happen? In my mind, I'm thinking it's 0%. You may have a different opinion, dear listener. In my mind, it's 0%. Congress has proven itself to be just like us, dysfunctional and incongruent, and there's very little likelihood that they're going to be able to enact any legislation to legalize abortion in all 50 states. That's what it's going to take. And that's what the Roe versus Wade decision did. The Roe court, if you want to refer to it that way, that's what the Roe court did for pro-choicers. It gave that community of people, it gave people who believe in pro-choice the opportunity to organize and to have a piece of legislation put before the House, the Senate, and the President of the United States to settle this issue once and for all. The Roe versus Wade decision did not settle the law. As a decision rendered by a Supreme Court, it could be, as many decisions have been, altered if not overturned. Given that the logic that was employed in reaching the decision was so specious, it was only buying time. This was not definitively settling the issue. One last thing I want to say about the potential for this decision to be overturned. I thought it was hilarious that you had so many people on the left saying this is a new activist court, that this is judicial activism at its worst. Here's where a history lesson is necessary. Go back and look at what the conservatives, particularly the Catholics and evangelicals, look at what they said in 1973. The activist liberal court legalizes abortion nationwide. Many people, and I agree with this summary, many people believe that it was at that moment that the evangelicals, the conservatives, made a concerted effort in their minds, began to organize in order to change the complexity of the courts, of who actually sat on these courts, who these judges were, and for close to 50 years have put that policy into practice, into effect. Mitch McConnell has famously come out and said as much, dating all the way back to the early 90s. He's going to remake the complexion of the courts. Not only the Supreme Court, but federal courts, and to the extent that he could, through his lobbying, through his advocacy, he was going to try to remake state courts. This has been accomplished. Whether it is an activist court or not is often only in the eye of the beholder. I personally believe it is much easier to qualify the court that legalized abortion by way of the logic being used as an activist court than to say that a court that struck down such a decision is being an activist court. It's all the same. It's simply the lens which you look through to see the world. That is what we must do, dear listener. We must examine the lens by which we see the world to determine whether or not what we so despise, what we so believe that we are in contrast to, that we are in opposite of, is that us? Are we simply not them with a number of different labels? Are we not also using the ends to justify the means that we employ, thereby allowing into existence, into the universe, these nefarious means to be ultimately and inevitably used against us?
Act 2 Disinformation Governance Board.
Last year, I noted that the mainstream media in the United States of America had lost so much credibility with the people that it was becoming like the state media in a country like China, in particular like China, where most people in China don't believe state media. No matter what it's saying, they really don't believe state media. The Chinese, like us, they're trying to go along to get along. They want to go out and meet someone, get married, have children. They are endeavoring to further themselves in their career. They want to have a cushy retirement. They want to have the luxuries of a movie or a vacation, something to do on the weekend. Like Americans, I think most people in China are somewhat apolitical. And when they are being prodded to get upset about something, it's generally allowed a vocal minority, just as it is in the United States, that takes to the prodding, that follows orders, and starts throwing tantrums about what's going on. As you may recall, dear listener, I thought this was a good thing. The more eye rolls that we get, whether you're a boomer, whether you're Gen X, Gen Z, a millennial, the more eye rolls we get out of quote-unquote news, out of quote-unquote journalism from the mainstream media, the better. We give energy to the things that we pay attention to. And the less attention that we pay to the mainstream media, we're demanding a better product, or we're allowing a better product to emerge from somewhere else. Why do I raise this issue, you may ask? Why am I taking you down memory lane to a comment that I made in a podcast last season? Subtly, slyly, deceptively, you could say, the Department of Homeland Security announces the formation of the Disinformation Governance Board, dubbed in the media, or social media that is, as the Ministry of Truth. What is the Disinformation Governance Board, you might ask? It is a new federal agency charged with protecting national security by combating foreign misinformation and disinformation campaigns. That is its stated goal. Now, without commenting beyond what I've just said, not who is going to actually run this board, what kind of people are going to populate it, what kind of power this board may have, what kind of leverage it may be able to exert out in the marketplace? The United States federal government, over the course of the last 20 years, has proved itself to be completely incapable of determining what is mis- or disinformation out in the public square. We had years and years of nonsense spewed out in the mainstream media and from the federal government, whether it be the FBI or the Justice Department, about this Steele dossier, a dossier that turns out to be completely fabricated. Only years later was that completely debunked, and it was not done so by the United States federal government. It was by independent journalists. Most recently, Hunter Biden's laptop, the scandal that broke from that, was qualified by the United States government, by a number of former employees of the security state. The story was qualified as Russian disinformation. 2 years later, it is now pretty clear that not only was it true, that there wasn't any real investigation done into that story in order to qualify it as misinformation. Then you start to factor in who has been appointed to actually head this Disinformation Governance Board. The woman's name is Nina Jankowicz. All you have to do is type that name into Twitter, and some almost comically, hilariously disturbing things come up on your Twitter feed. If you created a movie in Hollywood and it was a complete spoof, it was basically Airplane or Police Squad, if it was a National Lampoon movie, if you created this spoof and you called an agency, a non-existent governmental agency, let's say the Disinformation Governance Board, and then you had a cartoon character of a leader of that organization, it would be this woman, Nina Jankowicz. The icing on that cake, the cherry on that sundae, is this really broad and open title of disinformation expert. I did not want to spend a ton of time, but I did Google disinformation expertise, disinformation qualifications. I tried to find out how this woman came to be bestowed the title of misinformation expert. As you might imagine, it's really no more glamorous than any other correspondence degree that you can get online. As laughable, as cartoonish as it all sounds, it's real. My initial reaction was, good. This is going to more quickly bring about the separation of the mainstream media, of the government, from the American people. And that's not to say that there's some sort of revolution coming and there's going to be people marching in the streets. It's going to be very similar to living in an authoritarian or a totalitarian state. The state-run media is going to make proclamations. People are going to roll their eyes. They're not going to take any credence. They're not going to give it any credit. They're going to just go about their daily lives and realize this is more propaganda. What then struck me was how much damage that's going to do until we can reach a new normal, a better state of affairs when it comes to the way the media interacts and operates within our society. There's a lot of this self-help and self-improvement material out there in the universe right now, particularly on social media. Some of it's secular, some of it religious. What's common among many of these types of posts, among many of these types of programs or courses, it's the concept that in order to make great strides, you're going to have to go through some pretty discouraging depths. You're going to have to go through some ugliness in order to get to that higher level that you want to reach. And much of this is psychological. When you take a course, particularly if you've paid for it, when you read a book, you go through some sort of program, you go to a seminar, and you don't get immediate results. In fact, you often get the opposite. It's smart to reassure the consumer that not only are your pitfalls something to look forward to, they're signs of progress. You're breaking through. You're dropping all of the old, this former self, and you now have the capacity to build anew. When you're going through hell, just keep going. The old quote from Winston Churchill. Well, that sounds great, but look at it from the context of what are we going to go through over the course of the next few years with an organization like the Disinformation Governance Board being part of the Department of Homeland Security. Will this type of governmental agency be able to censor content out there in the public square, whether it be through the mainstream media or a social media app? I've spoken about it on the podcast before. You never cede to the government any of your power, because even though you may support the ceding of that power in the moment that you're doing it, you may support the administration that's in the White House, you may support the administration that's in the governor's office. Once you cede that power, it's never going to be given back, and you have no idea how it's going to be used by a future administration. Having an organization that's part of the federal government that may be empowered to censor content based on what? As we've already seen, based on social norms, based on political maneuvering, based on the expertise of people that look like they have no more education, experience, and knowledge than that can be gleaned from a correspondence course online. I personally don't think that it's going to be easy to go through the next few years, maybe even potentially the next 5 to 10 years, with clowns that you would laugh at seeing their posts on Twitter be given the power to then censor content not only on a platform like Twitter, but on any media platform in this country. The glass half full in me is saying this is the type of thing that we need in order to finally break the spell of the mainstream media on the American people, where particularly young people see it as an archaic institution that no longer serves the purposes that it once fulfilled in past generations. But the consumer in me, the one that actually wants to be able to go out and consume information, that guy's scared shitless.
Act 3, Better Call Saul Season Finale, Episode 4 Recap.
Episode 4 of Better Call Saul. I felt inspired to do a little bit of a different type of recap, given the input that I had over the Roe versus Wade controversy, if you will. The concept of the ends justifying the means, and how that plays into what everyone is speculating about the end of the show, what happens to Kim Wexler. There were several clues, in my mind, in episode 4 that indicate where this plot is going, where this story is going, what actually happens to Kim Wexler. When Better Call Saul began and the relationship with Kim Wexler was emphasized, it was only natural to speculate as to how it would all wrap up, knowing that Kim Wexler doesn't play any kind of role in Breaking Bad. Given that it's a prequel, what happens to her? Does she die? Does she have to run off for some reason? Is there some kind of rationale for her not being in Breaking Bad and yet she's still alive? One of my earliest ideas is that somehow she had the same situation that happened to the Jimmy McGill character, to Saul Goodman. She got herself into some kind of situation whereby she had to disappear. Now, that may not mean that she had to disappear in the way that Saul Goodman had to disappear, had to claim an entirely new identity, but that something happened to her where she was either disgraced or she was disgusted with Jimmy, and she decided to either leave the law and leave the state of New Mexico, or simply leave the state of New Mexico and practice law somewhere else, never to be heard from again. It was either that, or she was killed, she committed suicide, she was murdered. In that order, let's say killed is car accident, let's say suicide is somehow either despondency over something that she did, or her relationship with Jimmy, or they give her some kind of mental condition, similar to what happened to Chuck. And then, of course, murdered. She is murdered for something that Jimmy McGill, that the Saul Goodman character, has gotten himself into. And of course, in the universe of this show, the universe of the Breaking Bad show, people are often ancillary targets. The family members, the friends, the acquaintances of some of the major actors, the major players in the universe, are unintended consequences of the violence that ensues from the drug trade. This episode, episode 4, has turned my head on what happens to Kim Wexler and has now given me at least the possibility. I think that it is an open question as to whether or not she still not only exists and is alive in the universe of Breaking Bad, but that she is still present in Jimmy McGill's life, in the Saul Goodman universe, and that she's not only present, she may be an equal partner, if not a majority partner, in the way Saul Goodman runs his business, runs his law firm. Let's look at some of those clues. As I have stated in prior recaps, the way that Bob Odenkirk is playing the Jimmy McGill, Saul Goodman character this season is not consistent with that flamboyant Saul Goodman that we know from Breaking Bad, and even the flamboyant character that Jimmy McGill becomes in certain situations over the course of Better Call Saul. After his escapade in the desert, there is an open reluctance to do some of the things that he has done in the past, and there is certainly a reluctance to engage in these sophisticated plots, these nefarious plots. I don't think that it was coincidence that when the Jimmy McGill character gets mad at Howard Hamlin, he does no more than throw bowling balls over the wall of his house to ruin his car and sends prostitutes to confront him in a public place. Basic revenge, sophomoric, you could argue, but it's certainly not a nefarious, a sophisticated plot to ruin the man. Kim, on the other hand, she's all in. And not only is she all in, I think that she realizes that she has not only a willing partner in Jimmy, but that she is just as cunning and as savvy and as sophisticated as he is in employing these schemes and actually thinking them through, then acting on them, and then covering it up. That brings me to the ends justifying the means and the character turn, the character arc that she's had over the course of the show. Look at her character arc over the course of Better Call Saul and the fact that she has now given up everything that she worked for in the law to defend your poor, your tired, your huddled masses. She wants to help the little guy. She wants to help those that feel like they don't have a place in society. They're not represented. They're disenfranchised. You name the word. She's punching up, so to speak. In doing so, I think she's getting bolder and bolder that the ends certainly do justify the means. And that if justice is truly to be enacted, if justice is to materialize, you can't play by the rules. Justice is not blind. That scale is weighted against you. And therefore, you have to put your thumb on the scale, and you have to do that any way that you can. The ends do justify the means in the mind of the Kim Wexler character. I see that as how she can completely justify the actions that they're taking to ruin Howard Hamlin, while at the same time she's courting Clifford Maine, the attorney that Jimmy used to work for, that she has a relationship with, to do what? To start a pro bono law firm, if not a pro bono arm of his law firm, defending with much more capable attorneys, with much more resources, those that can't afford an attorney. The ends justify the means. Just speculating about the timeline of the show, I see this whole thing with Clifford Maine falling through, and Kim realizing that the only true way that many of these people who can't afford a top-notch attorney from one of these white-collar, these top 10, top 50 law firms, they have to go to Saul. They have to go to the Saul Goodman type character that may look on its face like a joke to most people, but in fact is deceptively a very capable, a very successful counterweight to the power of the state. The Goliath that is the state against the little guy. If some rules need to be bent, if some laws need to be broken in order to properly represent the little guy against the Goliath that is the state, that is the prosecutor, well, does it not appear that Kim is making that turn in her head in a much sharper direction than Jimmy McGill? That Kim Wexler is more willing to go to the lengths that are necessary in order to put her thumb on the scale to even out the scales of justice than Jimmy McGill is. So what Bob Odenkirk is doing, his portrayal, is not an accident. It's intentional. What they're showing is that Jimmy has this moral compass that he's still wrestling with. And that Kim, for her part, once she starts to make the turn, she makes it fully. Once she starts to realize that you have to put your thumb on the scale of justice, she's more than willing to do so, without any guilt, without any of the moral regret. Jimmy is in many ways a pleaser. He always was trying to please Chuck, and now it looks like he's trying to please Kim. He wants to be seen as a winner. He wants to be seen as successful. Like the rest of us, Jimmy McGill just wants to be liked. Look at the way that Jimmy retells the story of having to pick up the sign in order to move it over to the car so that Howard would not suspect that his car is no longer in the same parking spot. And then look at the turn when Kim starts talking to him about whether or not they're evil. I didn't see in Kim's character, and maybe this is just me, regret or remorse. I saw Kim as saying, do you think on the moral compass that we fall on the side of evil? Not that she's going to change course, but is that where we're at? It was Jimmy that had to reassure himself and Kim that no, what they're doing is not evil. It's just a turn of phrase. It's a figure of speech. Sitting there watching it, I thought the Kim character is willing to be labeled as evil if she believes that those ends justify the means that she's trying to reach. That brings me to the second part of the episode that's giving me this impression that Kim is not only alive in the universe of Breaking Bad, but may be an equal partner, if not pulling the strings, to Saul Goodman, Jimmy McGill. Mike Ehrmantraut comes in to the diner that she's in, sits down next to her, and basically says, look, those guys that you've been seeing following you, they're my guys. They're not the police. They are here to protect you because Lalo lives. And what does Kim say? She, of course, has the turn in her head, oh my God, we're in danger. But she rightly inquires, why are you telling me? And the simple answer from Mike Ehrmantraut, I thought you were made of stronger stuff. The Mike Ehrmantraut character recognizes that she's the backbone. She's the foundation. She's the strong one. That Jimmy isn't that strong a person. That he isn't the person that you can rely on in moments where you need true courage. Cue the scene of Kim meeting Jimmy at what is the eventual office of Saul Goodman. And what do you have? You have this interaction where, yes, he says it's a shithole, it's in a bad part of town, and she talks him through all the advantages that Saul Goodman would have, the Saul Goodman character, in officing in a place like that. Moreover, she doesn't mention at all to Jimmy that Lalo is still alive. That's when it struck me. Not only does she see herself as the more courageous, as the foundation, she knows there's things that she can tell Jimmy and there's things that she can't tell Jimmy. Look at that turn between Jimmy going out in the desert, coming back and lying to her about what happened, and now her having the knowledge, Kim having the knowledge that Lalo is still alive, and her being able to play that off, stone-faced, without any reservation, in order to protect the two of them. Kim is protecting Jimmy. Kim understands that Jimmy needs to be protected. Oh, I think she's still out there, dear listener. I think she's still out there in the universe of Breaking Bad. I think that she's still in the city of Albuquerque. I think she may even be living with the Jimmy McGill character throughout the course of the show. And she may be working in league with him to run the law office, building it into a partnership with Walter White and Jesse Pinkman. What if, dear listener, this show, Better Call Saul, wasn't just how Jimmy McGill became Saul Goodman. It was how Kim Wexler and Jimmy McGill became Saul Goodman. What if it's the history of how each one of those characters made the turn in order to make Saul Goodman possible? It's fun to speculate about these things, is it not? This is why we love television. This is why we love good writing, good directing, the plots. This is why I so enjoyed The Wire. I so enjoyed The Shield. I so enjoyed Mad Men and Breaking Bad. Not only is it fun to speculate about what's going to happen, you actually have the minds. You actually have the artists that can tie this all together, and you're not disappointed how it's going to turn out. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.